Thank you, Eric Ward and Oren Siegel. To everyone, hello and welcome. In Deuteronomy 16:20, we are reminded, justice, justice you shall pursue. It's incredible to be here with all of you, over 300 K-12 educators, city government officials, administrators, police, and community members seeking to create a more just world. This is the work of Jewish Federation. What I appreciate in the conversation we just heard between Eric Ward and Oren Siegel is how they have set a foundation for the deep work of today's conference. They've given us an example of dialogue and a way of being in relation with each other that allows for us to learn, to grow, and to change our thinking. They have introduced us to anti-Semitism and how it operates in political and ideological spaces. Even further, they have made visible that anti-Semitism, like racism, has a cost, a very human cost. They've asked us to think about the burden it places on our psychological well-being, our physical health, our ability to congregate and celebrate communally, and how it weakens the foundations of American democracy. The portrait they have painted of anti-Semitism in America is in some ways obvious, and in other ways difficult to fully comprehend without understanding the ways in which Jewish identity has been constructed throughout history. And while there is not one definitive Jewish identity, our next speaker will critically explore the shared elements of collective Jewish identity. He will provide a deeper understanding of how anti-Semitism is linked to Jewish personhood and internalized by Jews. It is an incredible privilege, and I am honored to introduce Ambassador Rabbi David Saperstein. In 2014, Rabbi Saperstein was confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the first ambassador at large for international religious freedom, a position that serves as principal advisor to the President and Secretary of State and the United States' chief diplomat on issues of religious freedom worldwide. He served for 40 years as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, has headed several national religious coalitions, including the Coalition to Protect Religious Liberty, and served on the boards of numerous national organizations, including the NAACP, the National Religious Partnership on the Environment, and the World Bank's World Faiths Development Dialogue. Put simply, he is a champion of justice. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Rabbi David Saperstein.
My friends, this is a remarkable conference, and it's such an encouraging insight into the Orange County communities to see such a strong turnout on this urgent and vital issue. Indeed, considering the long history of what is often called the world's oldest hate and the devastating impact it has wrought, anti-Semitism feels for many Jews as a survival issue. No matter how thriving the community of which they are a part might be at any given moment. And this is true for many in the Jewish community in Orange County. It is true for Jews around the world. To my rabbinic colleagues who are here, let me just say it is good to be with you again, and thank you for all you do. And let me express my appreciation to the array of the Federation professionals and to Heather Klein and the many lay leaders who put together this absolutely superb program of which I am honored to be a part. I want to particularly express my appreciation to Lisa Harmony, who has contributed so much to today's success. And Lisa, I have to say, your opening remarks were fantastic. They really, really were powerful. I would love to actually steal some of it for the future. And my appreciation also to Dr. Eric Ludwig, who so brilliantly led our Zelikow School of Nonprofit Management at the Hebrew Union College, I think the best such school in America, before assuming the role of president and CEO of the Orange County Federation. Thank you for the introduction, for your leadership in our movement in the broader Jewish community, and for what you do now in this vital role. Let me see if I can just tilt this down a little bit here. I've been asked to cover a great deal in my talk, and to adjust, so I'm not going to deal directly with the things that you just heard here. And what an extraordinary opportunity to have heard with Eric and with Oren here, two of the most knowledgeable, effective, and thoughtful voices in the fight against anti-Semitism. But I've been asked since there are a number of non-Jews in the room, as Eric indicated, I was asked to say a few words about the Jewish people, about who and what we are, what our fears and hopes are, how our varied identities interact with anti-Semitism that brings us together today. In particular, it is important to understand that Judaism is not just a religion, that the Jewish people are not defined just by religious identity. Perhaps the most illuminative way I can think of approaching this is to ask you to think back to the formative period of Jewish life, meaning from the time of the biblical Exodus from Egypt through the exile 1,500 years later, the majority of Jewish people from their homeland under Roman rule. Think of the surrounding nations, empires, civilizations, Egypt, Babylonia, Persia, Rome, Greece, the surrounding Canaanite nations. What were they? Were they religions? Every one of them had their own religion. Were they cultures? Each of them had their own language, literature, music, dance. Were they nations? Each one of them had a distinct national identity. Were they ethnic peoples? Each were comprised of what today we would call ethnic groups, sometimes a number of ethnic groups, but often held together by a sense and identity of peoplehood they carried with them even when they were moved beyond their national borders. The only difference between those ancient civilizations and Judaism is that they all died out. Only the Jewish people have maintained a chain of unbroken continuity of identity over the millennia. So today, there are Jews who identify mostly or entirely by their religious life, their worship, their rituals, their sacred texts. There are those Jews who may never go to synagogue, but are proud cultural Jews, interested in Jewish books, music, foods, celebrate Jewish holidays as secular Jewish celebrations. There are Jews whose Jewish identity is without ritual observance, but bound up with Jewish values, most particularly, according to the polling data, engagement with struggles for social justice and social equity. Which is, according to the polls, one of, if not the most common way that American Jewish identity is expressed. And there are many whose Judaism is their national identity, their commitment to Israel, and the central role that Israel's always played in Jewish thought, life, history. So are we a nation, a religion, a culture, an ethnicity? In truth, overwhelmingly, most Jews are a combination of those. But all of these, and perhaps more, are expressions of what it means to be a Jew, and anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred, speech, acts, can target any or all forms of this Jewish identity. Now, there's an intense discussion today about those engaged in fighting anti-Semitism, about what is the proper definition of anti-Semitism. Right now, 3 of those definitions have gotten a lot of attention, analysis, and debate, albeit there are other such efforts by a wide variety of academics, organizations, and experts of all kinds. But listen for a moment to the 3 ones that get the most attention now, and please listen for what they all have in common. The protection of Jews as Jews in any of the identities I've discussed. There's a well-accepted definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the so-called IRA definition. It says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Just to explain, by the way, the reference to non-Jewish individuals is those who an anti-Semite thinks is a Jew and engages in anti-Semitic activity against. It doesn't matter whether they're Jewish or not, it's an act of anti-Semitism. This definition calls itself, it begins by saying this is a non-legally binding definition, and it's widely accepted by hundreds of nations, localities, universities, other institutions. There is a nexus in a definition, a project that began with a USC task force, but has moved to Bard University. It says, anti-Semitism consists of anti-Jewish beliefs, attitudes, actions, systemic conditions, includes negative beliefs and feelings about Jews, hostile behavior directed as Jews because they're Jews, and conditions that discriminate against Jews and significantly impede their ability to participate as equals in political, religious, cultural, economic, or social life. And there is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism that says, a much shorter phrase, anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. Now, why is this debate over definition important? On the one hand, an answer is, how do you fight anti-Semitism if you can't identify what it is? How does somebody know when something's anti-Semitic if you can't identify it? On the other hand, we don't hear debates over definitions of anti-black racism, of misogyny, of anti-Asian hate, of LGBTQ plus hate. We kind of accept intuitively it's a category, kind of know it when we see it. We don't get caught up in this definitional battle. Good arguments on both sides. What to keep in mind is, on any standard, there's an overwhelming consensus of what falls into the category. Think of what you saw in the remarkable video in the beginning, right? I mean, overwhelming consensus of those being acts of anti-Semitism, and they're being profoundly morally wrong and often legally criminal activity. Where they differ, these definitions, has to do a lot about Israel. And when comments about Israel and criticism of Israel can spill over a line of what's anti-Semitism. On that, there are differences. Also some differences, by the way, what I said before, and I said IRA is a non-legally binding definition. It's how it defines itself, but there have been efforts in some places to use it as a legally defined definition. And there's a big debate over whether that is a helpful thing to do or a really counterproductive thing to do by limiting what is and isn't, what has to always be a context analysis of what comprises anti-Semitism. Since Israel is such an important part, just a moment about the Jewish narrative about Israel. Paradoxically, we Jews are at once a globally cosmopolitan community, yet consider ourselves an indigenous community. For 3,800 years, From the time Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees and followed God's command to go to Israel, our destiny has been tied up with the land of Israel. For the past 3,200 years, 3,200 years, there has been a continuous, unbroken Jewish presence in that land. And even when we were victims of ethnic cleansing, as when the Babylonians took the leadership classes of the Jews to Babylon, later the Romans forced most Jews into exile from their historic homeland, the attachment to Israel remained. Wherever Jews lived, Israel in the dream to return to Israel was fully woven into the culture, the daily and holiday prayers, the rituals, ceremonies, liturgy, the language of the Jewish people. I mean, think about it for a minute. The term Judaism and Jew is derived from Judea, central part of historic Israel. Of course, today, we must, and most Jews do recognize, that the Palestinians and Bedouin communities in Israel have their own authentic claims as indigenous communities there, and that many Palestinians believe as deeply in their gut as we Jews do in ours, that they have a right to their national identity in their homeland. That requires compromise to balance out competing valid moral claims, but it does not in any way lessen or negate the legitimacy, the right of the Jewish people to their national identity in their historic homeland. This question of where the line should be drawn is a difficult one. When does criticism, even harsh criticism, even wrong criticism, when does it become anti-Semitic? Or is advocating BDS, economic pressure on Israel, when is that a legitimate use of economic pressure against policies one disagrees with? And when does it cross into anti-Semitism? Some would say any use of BDS falls into that category. Others would say no. Targeted anti-Semitism change policy is something we do all the time, all over the world. We support that. Sanctions against Iran, sanctions against Russia. Here, many Jews were involved with sanctions in the United States against states that did boycotts of states that didn't support the Martin Luther King holiday or the Equal Rights Amendment. We all use that all the time here. But when does it step over a line? When does the use of the term apartheid step over the line? If it's a warning about a direction Israel is heading to, is that the same as saying it is analogous to the apartheid state of South Africa? Because one of the forms of anti-Semitism that all the definitions agree on is comparing Jews to Nazis, comparing Israel to Nazis and to apartheid South Africa, which the idea is not the merits of the critique of the policy, but to say this is an illegitimate state, so evil, it does not have a right to exist in the form that it is. Here, that clearly steps over a line. These are complicated issues. We have to recognize that. But understanding what they are about can be really helpful, and understanding the overwhelming unanimity almost, or consensus more accurately, of the broad range of anti-Semitism, of stepping over the lines, as I indicated, whenever the legitimacy, the right of the Jewish people to their national identity and their historic homeland is denied. And then all the other overt acts of anti-Semitism, on that, there is overwhelming consensus. We know that there are historic word on histories of anti-Semitism here that I was told that Eric and Oren would be staying away from, and I should spend some time on it. Obviously, anti-Semitism has long historic roots in Western civilization, most notably in Christian thought and Christian history. The Christian doctrine of contempt, that is, the erroneous blaming of the Jews for Jesus' death and the intended belief that this resulted in God's cursing of the Jewish people. The belief that the covenant between God and the Jewish people ended when the new covenant with Jesus came about. The intense anti-Semitism of Martin Luther that infused certain segments of early Protestantism. All of these created a fertile field that other non-religious forms of anti-Semitism were able to flourish in them. The pseudo-scientific racialism that of the 1800s that Nazi ideology was based on was actually not directly derived from Christian anti-Semitism. No Nazi ideologists really cited Christian anti-Semitism as a source for their anti-Semitism, nor did Christian leaders back Nazi anti-Semitism as in development of Christian anti-Semitism. But it created a fertile field in which the seeds of this pseudo-scientific racialism of the Nazis were able to flourish. Now, the United States offered a very different experience for Jews, in that the state-sponsored, church-sponsored, academic-sponsored anti-Semitism, so common in Christian Europe for 1,500 years before the Age of Reason, was and remains the exception in American life. America created on Age of Reason values and theories mostly relegated such forms of anti-Semitism to the sidelines, the fringes of American religious, governmental, and academic sectors. Yet there have been numerous expressions of anti-Semitism in American history, beginning from when Governor Peter Stuyvesant tried to limit the citizen rights of the very first Jews to land in America in New Amsterdam in 1654. Or take the mid-1800s and the Know-Nothing Party's anti-Catholicism, anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish worldview captured significant elements of America. And there were white Christian nationalist aspects to the KKKs that animated its racist and anti-Semitic activities during the first half of the 20th century. And of course, there is a predominantly white Christian nationalism that resonates in today's politics. Consider what they are fighting for: a romanticized notion of the past, of white privilege, of white male domination. It is a world that no longer exists, in a world that is changing faster than ever. Consider just how fast it is changing. Some of these statistics are startling. In 2008, 54% of Americans identified as white Christians. Now, obviously, there were many whites who were not Christians and many Christians who were not white. But 54% still identified as white Christians. 2008. 11 years later, 2019, that number had dropped from 54% to 44%. 44% identify as white Christians in America. And that is frightening to many people. And as you heard before from Eric and Oren, when people are frightened by change they cannot control, they attribute it to forces that are secret, manipulating things, the conspiracy theories. They look for scapegoats, and Jews have been the quintessential scapegoats. They look for groups or theories that not just explain what's happened, but offer them the possibility somehow, as unrealistically as might be, of going back to something different. Going back to something that used to be in their imagination. Of course, in America, the other more normative strand of religious thinking ran through Roger Williams' notion of separation of church and state, Maryland's tolerant embrace of Catholics, although not so friendly to Jews in the beginning of its history, the comparative openness of Pennsylvania Quakers to minority religions, all of it feeding into the founders who shaped the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and our founding institutions. Almost all were believers in God. They created and affirmed in the Constitution's ban on a religious test for office, its guarantee of free exercise of religion for all, its ban on establishment of religion, and the intended notion of separation of church and state. they created for the first time in all of human history in America, the first time ever in history, a nation in which your rights as a citizen would not depend upon your religious identity, your religious practices, your religious beliefs. Like many of our fundamental rights, it took a while to actually get there. There were state establishments in some of the New England states going as late as into the 1830s here. But by the 1940s, the expansive Supreme Court interpretation of both of the clauses on religion in the Constitution really helped make that a reality. And it was an America that gave to Jews more rights, more freedoms, and more opportunities than we have ever known in diaspora life. And yet, we still feel by every poll a vulnerable community. And you watch that video, and the reasons become clear. Even so, into the 20th century, anti-Semitism would spill into more mainstream segments of American society. As the historian John Meacham describes, in American democracy, religious freedom had been an inestimable boon to the Jewish people, allowing us to thrive here as we have nowhere else in our history. Yet, we know a more troubling legacy, those are my words. This is now John Meacham's words. Here in America, where Father Charles Coughlin spewed Jew hatred on his 30s radio show with statements like, "When we get through with the Jews in America, they'll think treatment they received in Germany was nothing." Coughlin's broadcast reached 30 million Americans a week for years. Here in America, where aviation hero Charles Lindbergh spoke at a rally of the Isolation American First Committee in 1941, he nodded at Jewish suffering in Germany and then added his take on us in America as American Jews. Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, our government. Let's not forget Henry Ford, whose newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, was a regular and popular platform for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this made-up conspiracy theory of Jewish control of the world. In 1938, just 1 year before the war, Adolf Hitler awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle, the highest honor the Nazis bestowed on any foreigner. But so transformative were the political, legal, and cultural impacts of the post-World War II, post-Holocaust era that we saw, along with the expansion of freedoms and opportunities for long marginalized segments of our society, women, racial minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities in America. We saw a dramatic decrease in the percent of Americans who held anti-Semitic attitudes or who would be willing to express anti-Semitic attitudes. According to the American Jewish Community, according to the ADL, the percentage of Jews who reported hearing recent criticism of Jews plummeted from 64% in 1946, from 64% to 16% in 1951. Wasn't that it disappeared, just cultural constraints made it inappropriate to give expression to them. And for the next 50 years, it seemed as if there were a consensus in America that you could not make it in national public life or national politics if you expressed racist or anti-Semitic attitudes. And the percent, one of the first things I did when I took over the Religious Action Center in 1976 was to hold a conference for the Conference of Presidents, the president and executive director of all the major Jewish organizations, to meet with the Democratic candidates president that year. It was Jimmy Carter's first meeting with Jewish leaders, national Jewish leaders ever. All of them came, all 8 of them came to speak to us. To our utter surprise, George Wallace came. I have to confess, in 1976, the building was not disability accessible. We carried him up in his wheelchair into the room. He stood there, and he began by saying, "Let me begin by apologizing for some of the things I have said about Jews and about African American, about Negroes in America." Those were his opening words. Did he mean it? That's not my point. My point was how powerful the social constraints were at that period of time. And the percent of adult Americans holding anti-Semitic attitudes declined from majority, according to the American Jewish Committee and other studies before World War II, a majority holding anti-Semitic attitudes, to the 11% holding ingrained anti-Semitic attitudes in 2020, according to the ADL. That's pretty remarkable. A number of factors: exposure to Jews in public, Jews spreading across the country into areas that had never known Jews before. Perhaps most importantly, the increasing levels of education from the end of World War II until about the year 2000, when they flattened out. Here we know that the higher the level of education, the less likely you are to hold racist, misogynist, anti-Semitic attitudes. Every one of us knows it is not an inoculation. Across economic, educational, ethnic, racial lines, anti-Semitism can be found. And today, the politicized anti-Semitism we feel on college campuses belies the. But if you look at 330 million Americans as a whole, it still remains true: the higher the level of education, the less likely we are to engage in such attitudes. Here, which says one thing, that for the 85% of the American people who go to the public school system, wherever you may send your kids, saving the public school system of America is absolutely indispensable to the future of democracy in America and combating this. But in recent years, we have seen a reversal of this. It is deeply alarming. It really is. In America, it's not just Jews who are affected. We've seen it in our own country and across the world, this explosion of anti-Semitism and the spread of hate speech and hate acts. We see acts across, again, in America against Jews, Muslims, Asians, Sikhs, gays, women, African Americans in escalating numbers. Here in California, there was a 33% increase in hate crimes in 21, a 32% rise in anti-Semitic acts. Catholic, LGBTQ+, Asians, blacks, all faced significant increases in hate crimes in California last year. In America, indeed, throughout the world, we have witnessed the degradation of civil discourse, first in the dark corners of the internet, then more publicly exacerbated by the anonymity of social media, and then the stamp of approval of such rhetoric by too many leaders in our nation. And the damage such hate crimes inflict on their victims and on America can be great and requires a national and a communal response, which is why this gathering is so important. For hate crimes are more than mere acts of violence. They are more than murders, beatings, arsons, desecrations. Hate crimes are nothing less than attacks on the values that are the pillars of our republic, the guarantors of our freedoms. They are betrayal of the promise of America. They erode our national well-being. Those who commit these crimes do so fully intending to tear at the too often frayed threads of diversity that binds us together and makes us strong. They seek to divide and conquer. They seek to tear us apart from within, pitting American against American, fomenting violence and civil discord. As Dr. King said in the wake of the Birmingham church bombing, that those 4 girls who perish have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produces the murderer. In the end, whether in the U.S. or globally, we must confront, delegitimize, and combat anti-Semitism, recognizing the paradox that anti-Semitism is capable of taking on its own life, regardless of what happens in the rest of society, even while we recognize that unless we ensure religious freedom, safety at sites of worship and other holy sites for all peoples and all religions, an end to accepted hate speech, vigorous efforts against hate crimes, against any marginalized groups, then no group in America, not Jews or anyone else, will be safe. Let me shift finally from Orange County, from America to the global scene. Eric and Ora made clear the global context of anti-Semitism crisis in the reach of the internet, the spread of social media, and taking messages of hate, disinformation, conspiracy theories, spreading them almost instantly across the globe, and how challenging and difficult it is to regulate, control, staunch such speech, extremist canards, conspiracy theories, dis and misinformation. They are never contained within a single country. Extremists in one place feed on the fears and theories of those in other places. We've seen this with so many of the terrorist acts around the world, done in the name of replacement theories that we heard about, and other forms of expression here, of expressions of hate. The result has been in the latest statistics in 2021 provided by the ADL in its Global 100 yearly study, and the invaluable work of the Cantor Center at Tel Aviv University, really one of the best in looking at global anti-Semitism, an alarming rise in anti-Semitic acts. They're fed by the intensification of the populist right taking place in the context of growing authoritarianism across the globe. It's not just in America. There are pressures on democracy. Freedom House, one of the most respected reporters on trends on democracies and authoritarianism, points out in their studies and analysis from the end of World War II through the year 2006, with ebbs and flows every year at different places, the midpoint of human rights and democracy moved in an expansive direction. And from 2006 until today, it has moved consistently backward across the globe. How alarming. 80% of the world's population live in countries with serious restrictions to religious freedom, either from government or societal forces, growing anti-Semitism. Here, we've seen it in response to the Gaza-Israel conflict in 2021. We saw it infuse the anti-vaccination movements from the U.S. to Germany, where it was particularly intense. Ironically, the Abraham Accords have spurred both new hope and new conspiracy theories about Jewish manipulation of world politics. In Pakistan and Indonesia, two countries in which I'm doing work, both against anti-Semitism and on behalf of religious freedom, in Pakistan and Indonesia, the two most populous Muslim countries in the world, both with almost no Jewish presence at all, we've seen significant and alarming growth in anti-Semitic attitudes. Remember, Europe has seen numerous anti-Semitic attacks over the past year. You know many of them. The attack on the school in Toulouse, 3 children, a teacher perished. In 2012, the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels, 4 people perished in 14. The Copenhagen, where a security guard perished when a bar mitzvah was attacked. The 2015 killing of 4 Jews at the Hyper Kosher supermarket. The 2020 Yom Kippur attack at the synagogue in Halle, Germany, where the shooter, not able to get in, killed 2 bystanders. Jews have been attacked on the streets of Germany and France. Increasingly, Jews are fearful of wearing kippot or other identifying clothing or symbols. That is a change here, and almost everywhere you go, there is a police presence protecting communal institutions. And that's a change from the prior World War II era. Today, almost everywhere, governments are working to help Jewish communities ensure their protections and against anti-Semitism, albeit not in every European country, but in most that is the case. The COVID epidemic, with many people staying home, saw a drop in anti-Semitic rates in 2020 compared to 19, which was a very high year. But in 2021, they've returned to the 2019 levels. And The virus has created new conspiracy theories of the Judeo-virus, created by Israel, created by Jews in order to build new medicines that they would then sell to the world to their benefit. So what then do we do together to address this? There are great breakout sessions that are going to discuss this. Let me just mention just a couple of the most obvious. One, relationships are the sine qua non. Working together on common concerns, educating each other about each other, working to protect and strengthen our democracies, all are indispensable. And a time to build such relationships, to educate each other on our respective needs, our aspirations, our expectations from each other, is not in the middle of a crisis. It is like this gathering today, taking time, educating each other, cooperating, building trust and understanding. And the fundamental rule of coalitional politics, that if you want to have a friend, you must be a friend. If we want others to stand with us against anti-Semitism on behalf of Israel's security and strengthening the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel, we need to stand together with those partners on their issues on which we agree, that are vital to their well-being and central to their world values. So let me commend the Federation and its agencies for doing a great job here in Orange County in that regard. Look, what has been so extraordinary is how the religious and civic communities of America have arisen to come together after racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic tragedies have occurred. Muslims cleaning up desecrated Jewish cemeteries in St. Louis and Philadelphia. The president of a McClellan, Texas synagogue handing a set of keys to the imam of a mosque that had been burnt to the ground for as long as they needed it. Cleaning up together graffiti and repairing the vandalism that you saw in the video earlier. The entire communities that gathered in every place that these tragedies have happened, around the Tree of Life community, the Mother Emanuel community, everywhere where we have seen such tragic victimizations. All of this working in broad-based interfaith and intergroup coalitions that are a hallmark of America. One of the encouraging things is there is more interfaith cooperation and understanding today, globally and in America, than any time in human history. What a remarkable potential contribution that can be to the success of our efforts. And we work together to delegitimize hate acts and hate speech. Indeed, when people come together like you're doing today, across political, religious, cultural lines, to build together a better America for all, they are modeling the very kind of America we hope to create. This is something that the Jewish community is deeply committed to. We ourselves are a diverse community. We're thought of as a white, wealthy community, but our rates of poverty in our own community, even with all of our generous federation, social service agencies, is not much better than the general population. And those who live vulnerably just above the poverty line, are in accord with the general population numbers here. And we are growingly diverse in our racial characteristics, more and more Jews of color, more and more Asian Jews, more and more Jews from countries around the world with different backgrounds, all coming together. We're much more diverse than people are. But that's what America is. It's not surprising that's what the American Jewish community would be. And we look to all our political, religious, cultural, and civic leaders to help in achieving it. It is in that spirit that we gather today, committed that our uniquely religiously diverse nation shall remain united, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. As Rabbi Stacy Friedman observed, it is our compassion and our common humanity that defines us. It is the way people have united as allies and partners in standing up against hatred that defines us. It is the support so many have shown one another after each attack that ultimately defines us. It is the love and tears we have shed for each other at our vigils. That is what defines us. Well, may that indeed be the goal, the outcome, the blessing of this remarkable gathering. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Deepa Bharat, Global Regional